performance art events, sorry, this is a bit too low, of the past 5 or 6 years have been thoroughly inundated with amateur photography. The ease and accessibility of cell phone cameras have prompted a constant engagement with live events through photography, video, and the social media platforms that facilitate the transmission of both. Occasionally, the repeated playback of shutter sound files disrupts the flow of an otherwise silent performance, or spectators walking awkwardly close to the staging to locate the most picturesque angle will block views of the piece or perhaps even disturb the artist. Some artists and institutions have prohibited or limited documentation opportunities as a result. Such a response is as old as the genre itself, which in its ephemerality has always had some relationship to documentation. Rather than regarding these moments as nuisances, what happens if we attend to the value and meaning that audiences are producing with their networked cameras? The instantaneous reception of these images on social media marks a change in how performance is made known and the formation of the public for the work. In this talk, I consider how audiences use social media to investigate, mediate, collaboratively intercede on performances, and form publics. Scholars like Fraser Ward and Mathilde Widrick have recently undertaken to examine representations or inclusions of the public in performance works by Chris Burden, Valley Export, and other artists who challenge the distinction of public and private activities. They have distinguished between primary and secondary audiences of performance, that is, those who view the work live and those who witness it belatedly, and between informed and informative publics, those who are familiar with performance arts tropes, and those whose unfamiliarity clearly marks the radicalism of the artist's public gesture. These examinations of performance publics have focused on work that positions itself in public space or with respect to broader political issues. The performances discussed in this talk, Rux Media Collective's The Last International, Maria Laribaux's Laughing Hole, and Marcel Sparman's Black Box, show an important degree of openness to the contributions of audiences. They address matters of public concern, although in more local ways or through more affective means than previously studied performances in this regard. In particular, I'm interested in how audiences gather within existing networks or come together to form new networked publics that circulate these performances, either in real time or at a slight delay. Such publics occupy an interesting space, as Nancy Boehm and Donna Boyd point out in their essay on social media and publicness. Quote, social media introduce a conundrum of visibility as people's mediated acts are both visible and invisible in networked publics. End quote. Social media publics of performance may not utterly transform the visibility of an event. After all, the visibility of your own network is limited by your connections to others and their connections to others, etc. But I argue their acts of documenting collectively in real time produce meanings that nevertheless shift or extend these events in important ways. Rux Media Collective's The Last International was a complicated hour-long performance presented in the context of the high-profile Performa Festival in November 2013 in New York. On each of the 3 nights of the performance's run, audiences were invited into a party-like symposium in a Manhattan gallery. Rife with political and theoretical references, the work also conveyed awareness of contemporary visual art, immersive theater, pedagogical social practice, and absurdist theater traditions. The performance traversed centuries in its efforts to reconvene a new international workers' movement. It was primarily pedagogical in its approach. But perhaps as a result of their celebrity and inclusion within a predominantly visual art performance festival, the piece fell short of its intended activation of collectivist politics. As Nate Cohen wrote in his review in Art in America, quote, situated as it was behind a $25 paywall, the work started to look much like the self-congratulation of an art public that already knows exactly how to recognize itself. As soon as Nrula Sengupta and the performers had cleared the hall, the installation clambered back into motion as the revelers in the balcony resumed their criticizing and carousing as if uninterrupted, end quote. The records of audience participation and witnessing visible under the artist's name confirm this effect of the art public recognizing themselves. During the event, witnesses seated in the performance, in the background of some documents, appear some combination of polite, bored, and passively engaged, dutifully taking in the work that they paid to see, but having already seen so much like this, whether in New York's established performance scene or earlier in the month of Performa, they await the after party. New York art world figure Rag Vartanen, founder of Hyperallergic, tweeted several photographs that show audience members sitting with legs crossed in relaxed postures, leaning, etc. The appearance of the antique diving suit was a spectacular highlight of the performance, with not only Vartanian but several other spectators pulling out camera phones at that moment to document. Still, few other audience documents are publicly available online, at least not via Facebook or Twitter, making it clear that documenting as a mode of participating and producing meaning was not the main objective for most attendees. And yet, the Last International, like other interventions Rux has staged, may not be for the audience who attends. Formed in 1992 in New Delhi as a collective of 3 artists, Jabish Bagchi, Monica Narula, and Sudhabrata Sengupta, Rux is a wide-ranging practice across curating, publishing, performance, and sculptural installations. Their work has particularly concentrated on themes of globalized temporality and collective labor. Thus, the artists have described their larger project as a collaboration with what they call the missing crowd. The term communicates a mixture of idealism and melancholy as it articulates an imagined audience who will never show up. This permits the work's failure in the present, or rather, we might see how the relative lack of a networked public for this piece confirms the artist's intentions. More critically, though, it is work that merely dreams of participatory or collaborative interactions with audiences and offers up an incomplete project for those who are there and don't know what to make of it, or don't care. The lack of over-documenting of this event equally reveals its opaqueness in this instance, at least for now. In contrast to this call for an imagined audience of the future, though, Spanish artist Maria Larribó's performance Laughing Hole offers a different dynamic of meaning production in the expanded present of the event. This piece has been staged regularly since 2006, first in Europe and then premiering in the United States in 2013. The dancer-choreographer is known for her intense and durational body work, but a considerable portion of her recent practice is designed with a visual art context in mind. It makes use of the conditions of gallery spaces and/or the desire for an image by visual art audiences. Laughing Hole involves 3 women laughing semi-continuously for 6 hours in an enclosed space, typically a gallery, as they stumble across a floor littered with cardboard signs. Written in plain, bold, colorful letters, the carefully scripted signs spell out a range of issues regarding old age, gender norms, pro-democracy, anti-terrorist propaganda, anti-war, anti-counter-terrorist protest, scatological or sexual humor about holes, etc. The women laugh, their voices amplified, recorded, and mixed and fed back by a sound engineer as they pick up signs one by one, pose, pause, and tape the signs up to the walls. Billed as a critique of Guantanamo detention facility, but likewise critiquing feminine hysteria, the performance compels our witness of an enduring laughter that sounds a lot like crying after a few minutes. Although the women surreptitiously leave from time to time to make costume changes and presumably also water breaks, their bodies tire of laughing and they frequently slip and trip over cardboard signs in later hours, a breaking down that is scripted or planned for by the artist. Because of the large, clear signs and the choreographed still poses of the dancers, the performance works well for the camera. In the version that I attended live in February 2013 in Chicago, spectators with cameras, mostly cell phones, lined the walls of a dance studio space in the City Cultural Center on a cold Saturday morning. Because of the location in a busy public place, numerous passersby partook of the event, usually very briefly. The performance was part of a performance festival, and to that end, well promoted by School of the Art Institute professor Mark Jeffrey, who organized the festival. Because of some of the initial images posted, nearby students and friends showed up in the later hours of the performance, ensuring a steady audience with fresh energy. In the space of the performance, one was called upon to support and to empathize. I was there for about 90 minutes, finding it difficult to endure much longer. Although many of the audience sat silently, the women's laughter entreated me to join in when I could. Laughter is difficult to sustain, but laughter is also contagious, and it's easier in good company. There is at least one instance of an old man telling jokes to one of the performers to help sustain their laughter. And a review of subsequent performance at LACMA noted, quote, "Those of us who stayed became props for the performers who held signs in our faces or used our shoulders for leg rests," end quote. In ways both literal and figurative, audiences were crucial to performers' success in Laughing Hole. One could say that the opposite was also true. The performers were crucial to the success of the audience's documents. The dancers seem overwhelmingly aware of how their work is viewed as image. Earlier versions of the performance are comparable in visuality and their appeal as pictures. It is striking that one of the principal features of the performance, as it exists through documentation, is the way that networks support its continuation as a set of pictures. Even more striking is how banal so many of these photographs are when viewed belatedly, perhaps a consequence of the work's repetitive nature, sign after sign. Some people took selfies with the performers as background. Others focused on photographing the dancers and their signs. Images of the performance were widely liked, at least within the community of scholars, artists, and friends of Mark Jeffrey, an artist who was previously active in the UK performance scene and now a prominent force in Chicago's. All of this took place within the time of a durational performance event. One could draw parallels with the use of social media networking of audiences of several other recent performances, including Tilda Swinton and Cornelia Parker's The Maybe, 1995 to 2013, and Marina Abramovic's previously mentioned The Artist is Present in 2010. In these New York-based pieces, durational performance becomes partly a backdrop for the self-documentation of audiences, especially as these works persist in social media. Erica Fisher-Licht demonstrates in her book, The Transformative Power of Performance, how performance after 1960 has come to be understood as event, with important implications for the spectators who are transformed by the experience of their participation. She argues that the event of performance is generated by an autopoietic feedback loop between actors and spectators, rendering the meaning of the act perpetually elusive and perpetually held forth, while transforming audiences through an experience that they help to sustain. One might describe La Ribot's Laughing Hole as generating such an autopoietic feedback loop between performers and audience. Fisher-Licht also suggests, however, that mediation invalidates the procedure which requires co-presence to generate community or to exchange touch, feeling, or what the author describes as a field of energy. Writing in 2004, perhaps it is difficult to foresee the style of live mediation made possible by networked cameras in 2013-2014, and the enlarged field of energy, electrical, that consequently envelops live art. In my view, the autopoietic feedback loop is perpetuated precisely because of the act of documenting and mediating the performance in real time with the actors. Especially in instances of direct confrontation with performers and documenting spectators in Laughing Hole, one can see the productivity of their transmissions. That is, the women seem to be laughing at us, photographing them, and the absurdity that such a confrontation makes apparent. If Laughing Hole produces meaning through a sort of autopoietic feedback loop enhanced by mediation, Marcel Sparman's black box might rather be discussed in terms of allopoiesis, whereby the system produced through the exchanges between artist and audience produces something new in the process. Black Box is a series of performances that each present an enigmatic narrative of memories, touching on universal themes of language, voyage, and connection to Earth. The Berlin-based artist described it as an interruption of time and an exploration of holding protected facts of experience. Sparman silently assembles for the audience the uncomfortable smell of fish. In each performance, he breathed through a salmon head strapped to his face and approached wary spectators. A pile of rubble and early spring flowers, an unraveling stream of magnetic tape, the spilling of milk, and configurations of small paper boats, a factor which varied between different performances. Sparman creates through performance situations, as he calls them, that safely hold open the time and space of human interaction. First presented in Zurich in late 2013, he toured the performance in Houston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. in February to March of 2014. I witnessed Black Box 2 in Houston, shown here, part of the Houston International Performance Art Biennial. As a Facebook friend of the artist, I was also able to see the work's documentation unfold in real time on Facebook after each event. I was surprised to have the impression of having missed a completely different performance when the images of Black Box 3 in Chicago came online. These were not the minor variations to the artist's actions, materials, and setting that account for the novelty of a performance on tour. What was most notable instead was how these changes were reflected upon by the audiences in each situation. Here's another view of the Houston version. The first tagged photo of Sparman, of those shared publicly and available to my view in Houston, shows the artist leaning over a pile of dirt, strewn with ribbons of magnetic tape in a dim, spotlit space. The background of brick wall is broken up slightly by a mess of wooden crates on the left side of the image. This was neither the beginning of the performance nor its most impressive and photogenic moment. The fish head appears very large here, but its flesh is faintly visible. A few days later, the first tagged photo of Sparman in Chicago captures the artist lying on a large white floor. Shadows of his body and of an empty wine glass dance slightly, evoking an overhead track lighting system. Notably taken by someone who had been at the Houston show, this scene is from the beginning of the action. But the cropping and angle of the image emphasize the ground of the action more than the artist's body or overall tableau. We see only his body from the thigh up and only one prop. The second tagged photo in Washington, meanwhile, is somewhere between these two in form and content, but with a wider angle on the piece to give more of an overview. The artist is in motion near the beginning of the performance, with some elements, the dirt pile, the red yarn, and the glass, clearly in play. The fish head almost seems a bit fresher, maybe, or perhaps a different species of fish, it looks a little different here, than in Chicago. The red yarn features prominently, it's thicker than in previous versions, and the multicolored tiles and walls of the space are well illuminated. Rather than referring to a single narrative or some universal set of memories, I would suggest that, as visible in the documentation generated and circulated by networked social media publics, each performance diagnosed the character of its site. Houston as a pile of rubble constantly being demolished and rebuilt amidst ribbons of an oily substance and thick air evoked by the artist's labored breathing through the fish head. Chicago as a sheet of still, silent, cold ice while the city was encumbered by a particularly brutal winter in 2014. And DC as more formal, more controlled, and with more emphasis on travel through the artist's use of more paper boats in this instance. The performance gestures and props differed less than it would seem from these initial photographs. Although the variations of venue account for some of this effect, an alt-90s bar in Houston, an industrial modern performance gallery in Chicago, and the German Cultural Center in DC. What audiences picked up on in each performance were aspects that addressed their own concerns. Perhaps the artist was responding to each situation too, but the images recorded of these three performances show a spark of recognition, a tapping into what matters for those who were onlookers. And the likes and reposts on Facebook supported this. The public of each piece was assembled by bystanders rapidly uploading images and acts of support, affinity, and selection by audiences who were elsewhere. Very little of what would normally be considered interaction or participation happened during the black box performances, or so it seemed. But the live uploading of data about the event provided a way for disconnected spectators to form a coherent audience through mediation. This auto-archiving activity, as in La Ribot's Laughing Hole, gave spectators a way to participate and potentially collaborate with one another beyond the interpassive witnessing going on in the exhibition space. While more remains to be said about the nature of this participation, the impact of their documents on artists' ongoing practices, and the extent to which audiences are aware of their collective transmissions as supporting the formation of a public for the work, it is nonetheless clear that what they are doing has an impact on these performance events. Thank you.